really pleased to be joined on the Crispin Flintoff Show by Matt Kennard, independent journalist and author. How you doing, Matt?
I'm all right. Good to be with you. How are you?
I'm good. I'm just trying to get my head around all this stuff that's going on in the world. And basically, the reason I wanted to speak to you was because this definition of terrorism and also the question about whether Britain has been engaged with terrorist organizations at all has made me think what on earth was going on in 2005 when I happened to be about 50 yards from the bus that blew up in Tavistock Square. I'm sure everyone remembers that, but I'll just show. This is the bus that blew up. I was about 50 yards away in front of it when it blew up, and uh, I had a trauma therapy for roughly a year and a half. I couldn't walk over bridges. I was terrified of going on public transport. Lots of people in London was terrified at the same time, even if they hadn't seen it. And after the actual bus bomb, this is what Tony Blair had to say.
There will be time to talk later about this. It's important, however, that those engaged in terrorism realize that our determination to defend our values and our way of life is greater than their determination to cause death and destruction to innocent people in a desire to impose extremism on the world. Whatever they do, it is our determination that they will never succeed in destroying what we hold dear in this country and in other civilized nations throughout the world. Thank you.
I mean, when I saw that, I was livid because I'd been on the anti-Iraq war demo in 2003, and I thought, I'm not fighting your war for you here, going to work in London, and then to think that he's saying that they're the innocent people dying as well, making a point about innocent people dying, and we consider Iraq as well. I found that really difficult to stomach. But then this is what emerged after the bombing at Tavistock Square. It says, this is the BBC, Al-Qaeda claims London bombings. Al-Qaeda's deputy leader said for the first time the group carried out 7 July suicide bombings in London, which 52 people were killed. And I looked up the prescribed groups, terrorist groups, on the government website, and it says Al-Qaeda prescribed March 2001, and then it mentions in the second paragraph that the government laid orders in July 2013, December 2016, and May 2017, which provided that the ANF and this other group, and then it says at the end there, HTS should be treated as alternative names for the organization, which is already prescribed under the name Al-Qaeda. So the government is saying that HTS is one and the same as Al-Qaeda. And then as a prescribed group, you would think that would mean that they would not deal with them. However, this is what Annalise Dodds has said in Parliament. I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Lady for her comment. She's raised a number of issues for which I will deal in turn. First, she asked about the UK's engagement with HTS. I did talk about that in my statement, but I can provide additional information. It is clear that the fact that HTS is a prescribed terrorist group does not prevent the UK from engaging with it in our efforts to help secure a political settlement or from engaging with any future transitional government in Syria that includes HTS. Its prescription will not inhibit the pursuit of our foreign policy objectives in Syria and the UK will be guided by a set of core principles for any diplomatic interaction with the interim Syria authorities, with inclusion and the protection of human rights as key considerations. Blah blah. So Tony Blair's serious thing about not engaging with terrorists, we've got to defeat these people, and within a week of an overthrow of Assad, the UK government is now keen to engage with a terrorist organisation which is one and the same as Al-Qaeda, which committed the bomb in Tavistock Square and all the other bombs in London that day. Matt, I mean, this to me is a scandal. I mean, how is it that they can suddenly change tack on what is Al-Qaeda? Why are we even calling it HTS? Why don't we just call them Al-Qaeda? Why can't we just say the UK government is engaging with Al-Qaeda? That is the word that everyone knows them as.
Well, it is shocking, but it's not surprising because these groups and the term terrorism are just heavily loaded concepts. You know, these groups will be demonized by the media when they do things we don't like, but they will be, and the government, but they'll be lauded when they do things we do like. For example, overthrowing Assad. And basically, when state priorities change, the government policy towards these groups changes, and then the media portrayal changes because the media take their cues from the state. And you're seeing that very, very clearly because, as you say, it's not just the 7/7 bombings in London. If you look at September the 11th in the United States, the terrorist attacks there that killed 3,000 people, the worst terrorism in US history domestically. If you told someone on September 12th, 2001 in the US, oh, in 23 years, you'll be having our media, the US media, trying to whitewash the Al-Qaeda, they wouldn't believe you, but that's where we are. And it goes to the heart of UK and US foreign policy, which is that we use extremist Islamic groups and have done for decades to control the Middle East. And for a long time, that meant we wanted to destroy independent Arab nationalism. Kind of the emblematic figure of that was President Nasser in Egypt, who nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956 and actually engendered an invasion by the British, the French, and the Israelis. And there was a big move to support and to promote Islamic radical groups, Salafi groups, to get rid of Nasser, and it continues up to the present. You know, there's the famous example of the 1980s in Afghanistan when Operation Cyclone, which was CIA and MI6 as well, armed and trained bin Laden and other mujahideen in Afghanistan to weaken Russia. And then obviously 9/11 was blowback to that. So you come up to Syria and you've had over a decade of the same forces, the US, the UK and Israel, trying to overthrow the Assad regime. And then HTS come and do it. So they're like, okay, fine, you're not terrorists anymore. And they're trying to remove them from the list of prescribed organizations. But as you say, and as the UK government says, HTS is another name for Al-Qaeda. In fact, the history of Jolani, who's now the de facto leader of Syria, is extremely worrying because he was in Iraq from 2003 to 2006. And later, actually, he was imprisoned in 2006 by the US in Iraq, but he was part of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And their whole philosophy was to spark a sectarian war between Sunni and Shia in Iraq, which they eventually did. There were two bombings done by Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2006 and 2007 of Al-Askari Mosque in Samarra, in Iraq, which is the third holiest site in Shia Islam. And that kind of sparked the whole civil war, which caused unbelievable devastation in Iraq. He was eventually sent to Syria by Baghdadi, who became the leader of ISIS, and to set up Al-Qaeda in Syria, which was called Al-Nusra. And then he was in Syria for years, and then Baghdadi wanted to incorporate Al-Nusra into ISIS, and Jolani said no, and he created HTS as a result. But you know, the lineage is clear and the backstory is clear, and it's a sectarian terrorist organization which has full control. And you see, and it exposes how terrorism is used and the label terrorist is used, because you've interviewed people like Sarah Wilkinson, and you've heard how terrorism laws here are used to arrest, raid, terrorize independent journalists and activists who are speaking out for Palestine, yet HTS, as soon as they become useful to us, they're saying we'll now remove it from the prescribed list. So it's all smoke and mirrors, and it's all a way for the government to basically enforce its power and enforce its control across the world, and actually put us at risk. Because you mentioned Tony Blair and the 7/7 attacks and the relationship with Iraq. Now, it came out subsequent to the 7/7 attacks that many of the culprits of those attacks were motivated by the war in Iraq to carry out those attacks in London. And in fact, if you look into the history of the build-up to the war in Iraq, Tony Blair was advised by senior intelligence officers that going to war with Iraq would increase the threat of terrorism in Britain. This is pre the 2003 invasion. He did it anyway, even though Saddam wasn't a threat. And that was because of British oil interests and American oil interests. So they sacrificed their own security to promote their own the interests of the corporate elite. And that is the guiding dynamic of policy making in London and Washington. And actually, our security is way down the list of priorities when they're devising policy.
I mean, on that, I mean, I've been reading this book, Secret Affairs, which Britain's collusion with radical Islam by Mark Curtis, and in this book he outlines how the UK was supporting Pakistan at that time before the 2005 bombings, and that some of the people who were engaged in terrorism had been to Pakistan, and so in effect, because the UK had supported Pakistan, we'd actually helped these people to be trained in how to use bombs and stuff like that. So you can sort of do a little deal in Syria with Jelani, but how do we know that in a few years he won't be getting on with us, but we'll have given him loads of backing and he'll come back here?
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
just like you can't predict what the future is. You can't play with these people, can you?
No. And another example of this is Libya in 2011, where after the uprising against Gaddafi and then the NATO intervention, the British supported a whole load of Islamist groups that were militant radical groups, and then actually the Royal Navy rescued Salman Abedi from Libya, and Salman Abedi went on to bomb the Ariana concert, a Grande concert in Manchester. So again, it's what that, and they know what they're doing. They know how risky it is, but this is what goes to my point. That's not their priority. Their priority is getting rid of official enemies, so Gaddafi, Assad, Saddam Hussein, and to hell with the results. And and the British people are put at risk because of this. And that's why when they talk about MI6 and MI5 as security services, it's a misnomer. They're not about security. They're about enforcing British establishment interests abroad. And to hell with our security if it is put at risk by those policies. And I think that it's very, very clear now, maybe in a way that hasn't been clear before, because Jelani has been the subject of an instant makeover by the mainstream media as well. If you look at the Daily Telegraph particularly, which makes me laugh because, the Daily Telegraph, the most right wing of the mainstream newspapers, and it's read by little grannies in Somerset and stuff. And they're all these little grannies now are going to be like big fans of Jelani because there's this big propaganda campaign in the Telegraph saying that there was one article where it said he's diversity friendly after spending years trying to launch a sectarian war in the Middle East. There was another one that said he wants to take Syria but doesn't want to frighten children while he does it. And it's amazing how quickly the media step into line, because we know what our government does in terms of what interests it's promoting abroad, or some of us do. But yet in democratic theory, you're meant to have a media, which is a check on that. So the media should be doing all the things you're doing, which is saying, well, wait a sec, weren't Al-Qaeda the ones that bombed us not that long ago? But they don't do that. What they do is they perform their function, which is an adjunct to the state and an adjunct to state narratives, and promote those incessantly. And as you say, who knows what the results will be in years' time? Because I mentioned Operation Cyclone in Afghanistan in the 1980s. Obviously, that was the 1980s. September 11th didn't happen until 2001. So it took some incubation period. But you're playing with fire if you empower these groups and bring them in and help give them a makeover and call them moderate rebels. But they've been doing it for years in Syria. You know, Operation Timber Sycamore was the CIA operation, which was ordered by Obama in 2011. It started in 2012. This was one of the biggest covert operations in US history. Over $1 billion a year were put into arming and training rebels in Syria, and often unsavory terrorist groups as well. And there was even, it came out in a Seymour Hersh article in London Review of Books that about the dirty war in Syria, and he said that there was a rat line of arms that went from post-Gaddafi Libya to Syria after Gaddafi fell, and that was involved MI6. And in fact, CIA knew what they were doing was illegal, and didn't want to go through Congress, so they called it a liaison operation with MI6, and that got around that legal loophole. So there's a long history in this, and it's never analyzed and decrypted by the mainstream media as it should be, because people would be outraged if you lay out the facts as you did at the start about the contradiction between our safety and the policies of the establishment. And just to finish with the Libya case again, so there was an inquiry recently into the Manchester bombing, and basically tons of it was behind closed doors. So they have to do this stuff in secret because they know how bad it looks. You know, MI5 were letting the Abidi and his family as well go in and out of London, go in and out of UK ports all through in the years following 2011 and the uprising against Gaddafi, even though they knew they were Islamic radicals fighting in Libya. And that was so they are culpable, surely, for what happened in Manchester. And in fact, the families of some of the girls that were killed are really pushing hard to get justice for themselves, that their kids were killed because Britain thought it was in their interest to, or the deep state thought it was in their interest to promote these Islamic radicals in Libya. So it needs to change, but the way that we change it is publicizing it, because it's massively suppressed that we use Islamic radicals. As Mark's great book is one of the only documents that we have that really catalogues this long history of British foreign policy making.
Now, the other issue on this, I think, is this forgiveness of Jelani. I mean, like, he can be forgiven. He's seen the road. He's been on the road to Damascus, and he's seen the light. Why can't they have any forgiveness for Shamima Begum or anyone like that? Why is the media likely to forgive one person but not another? I mean, this is such a contradiction and a hypocritical way of looking at things. It doesn't bear scrutiny, does it?
No, and it's quite simple. The principle is, if you're useful to us, we'll forgive you and launch a PR campaign for you. It's the same if you look at what happened with Osama bin Laden in the 1980s. There's this famous article going around in The Independent with an interview of bin Laden, where it says the Islamic fighter on the way to freedom or something like that. It's actually by Robert Fisk, funnily enough. But so he was promoted in the Western media, and he was one of our freedom fighters in Afghanistan. And then obviously, as soon as 9/11, or actually in the 90s, they started attacking US sites, and he became an enemy. And Jelani, even though he was imprisoned by the US in Iraq in the 2000s, he's now taken out a dictator that we wanted to take out for many years. So he's forgiven of all sins. In fact, if you look at his record, he should be put on trial rather than be talking with any dignitaries from the West. I mean, he was up to all sorts of awful terrorism. As as I mentioned, in Iraq, particularly in Iraq, Syria as well, but particularly in Iraq during that civil war period. It was awful what Al-Qaeda in Iraq were doing. And then obviously Al-Qaeda in Iraq became ISIS. And that is even crazier because ISIS, you know, it's the most extreme, barbaric group. And he was part of that. And yet now we're selling him as some kind of moderate rebel and woke jihadi. It's madness. It's madness. And
Not like that anymore,
but the power of propaganda it is amazing because people aren't kind of questioning why this is happening or questioning what they're being told about Jelani. Obviously people on the sort of alternative media on the left are, but in general. He's being celebrated, which is insane, and will come back to bite us on the arse at some point. Maybe the biggest example of how Britain does not care about dictators if they do what they're told is to look at the 6 Gulf dictatorships. The biggest one is Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia was the Wahhabi dictatorship, and the House of Saud was installed by the British in the 1930s to keep the oil coming, you know, and to maintain geopolitical control over the Middle East. We put 11 soldiers inside the White Army, which is the personal protection force of the House of Saud, in 1964, just to defend them against democratic forces and to defend them against a possible coup which might displace them. So while the government's saying, "Oh, we're so happy that the dictator Assad has been overthrown," the taxpayers are paying and have done since 1964 under Harold Wilson, by the way, not a Tory. We've been paying to keep one of the most repressive and extremist dictatorships in the world in power. It's insane. So the whole ideology, the whole infrastructure of ideology which exists in our media is completely at odds with reality. It's completely Orwellian. But you can't work in the mainstream media unless you believe it. And actually, there's one really important point which links the two things. In the big reason for our relationship with Saudi Arabia in modern times is BAE Systems. 40% of British arms go to Saudi Arabia. Nearly all of that money from the Saudi dictatorship goes to BAE Systems. All of that basically comes from a deal that Margaret Thatcher signed in the 1980s called Al-Yamama, which was the biggest arms deal in history at that point, still playing out. But there was an investigation into corruption in some arms deal between the Brits and the Saudis when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, and there was an investigation by the Serious Fraud Office. And a Saudi official, this came out in court documents, a Saudi official said, unless you stop that serious fraud investigation, we will do another, this is a quote, we'll do another 7/7 on the streets of London. So we were threatened by an ally that they would do a terrorist attack on the streets of London, like the one that you saw, if they didn't nix the investigation into corruption in this arms deal. What did the British government do? It nixed the investigation. So it's a whole world, a murky world. It's a swamp filled with gangsters. And what we get fed in the mainstream media is a fairy tale. And we need to smash the fairy tale. Shows like yours, Declassified, Double Down News, there's loads of exciting alternative media, and that's what we got to build, because we've got to take on the narrative industries, because that's how they maintain control. The information war is everything.
Now, can I ask you one more thing before you go? I'm only new to the fact that the whole world is a bit stitched up with the media, and the fact that the military-industrial complex has got an agenda that isn't necessarily what we're told it is. You've been doing this for quite some time now. I'm depressed already, only having become awakened to it within a few, I don't know, maybe months, maybe years, not that long. We've been aware of this for quite some time. How do you keep going? Because it's quite depressing to think that all these forces are against us.
Yeah, and particularly working at Declassified, because you're banging, which I'm not at anymore, but did it for 6 years, and you're banging your head against the wall basically, and nothing is going to change because the British establishment is so embedded. You know, it's been in power basically 1,000 years since the Norman invasion, and they divvied up the land, and all those barons and people still exist, and they're so embedded, and they have such a deep structure of power that they're not going anywhere. But I have to say that in recent history, I think that their system is the weakest it's ever been, and in fact is collapsing. And you see that with Keir Starmer, because he's obviously an awful prime minister and doing nothing very different to the Tories at all. In fact, maybe on a lot of things is actually worse than the Tories. And that is that I think that's a sign that the system is collapsing, because the safety valve that could have maybe saved the system, ironically, was Jeremy Corbyn, because his moderate social democratic policies would have maybe taken some heat out of the system, and assuaged some of the suffering that is causing so much backlash against the system and the establishment. But the system itself destroyed him. So now we're left with basically one party with a red rosette and a blue rosette. But it can't go on forever. Unfortunately, what we're seeing now is that being taken advantage of by the far right and parties like Reform, which is surging. But obviously, in this kind of situation, when you have a fault line where things are really changing and collapsing, and the establishment is losing control of the narrative, which it is, it's an opportunity for the far right, 100%, but it's also an opportunity for the left, the real left, not the Labour Party left. So we have to step up. There's no time to be disconsolate, because we really do we're in a historical moment now. And if we don't step up, it's the far right that's going to gain, and it's lies and it's xenophobia that's going to gain. Whereas we have truth on our side, and we have principles that would bring about a better world. So we need to step up and fight and actually win, because another problem with the left is they like criticizing, but they don't mind not winning. But we need to win, because if we don't win, the alternative is Nigel Farage as prime minister, which will probably happen at some point. So it is depressing, but there's always hope. And actually, to be totally honest with you, when I was younger, before Jeremy Corbyn, I never really had any hope in Britain as a place where meaningful change will take place, because we're an imperial center and there's so much resources put into controlling it, which is still the case. And I always looked to Latin America, where there was a lot of hope. You know, there were liberation leaders, democratic socialist leaders getting voted in by massive popular movements. And that still is happening in Latin America. You know, you have Lula in Brazil, you got Luis Arce in Bolivia, you got Gustavo Petro in Colombia, who's the first socialist leader of Colombia. And so we should look to them and learn from them. There's a bit of arrogance in the Western left that, well, if you're thinking strategically about how you move forward and how you promote the left and how we get into power in the face of a hostile system, blah blah blah. What the first thing you should do is to say, well, where has it happened? And it has happened in Latin America. It's been happening there for 25 years. So I think we need to learn from them, and there are many lessons that we can learn from them. I go there quite a lot for family reasons, and they're much more embedded in working class communities. The parties themselves, they don't engage in the whole culture wars rubbish that the left is obsessed with in the West. They talk about economic issues that affect poor people. They talk about nationalizations. They talk about really bread and butter left issues, or what used to be bread and butter left issues here, but have kind of got lost in this whole culture war progression that we're seeing. So I think that if we can pull it back from that, which we can, and get some new young leaders, then the ground is there for change. And you saw that. Okay, I'll just finish with this because I'm blabbering on. But you saw that in 2015. Look, Jeremy Corbyn came out of nowhere. No one predicted it. Literally zero. And you had this massive outpouring of enthusiasm from young people, and soon after he was elected, the Labour Party swelled to the biggest party in Western Europe. He got within a couple of thousand votes of becoming prime minister in 2017, despite the Labour Party itself trying to destroy him. 2019 was a Brexit election. That was a different thing, but that shows that the ingredients are there in this country and the enthusiasm is there for real progressive change. So it's not gone away. They wanted to get rid of Corbyn after a year or two, but they weren't successful. Because they knew the longer he stayed in power, the longer people's eyes would be open to what was possible. And I still think the revolutionary moment that came around with his leadership, they haven't put it back in the box, although they're trying so hard. As we know, he's been expelled or kicked out of the Labour Party as alongside other people. But that's all there. It's all there. It just needs to be unlocked, and it's our job to unlock it.